Okay, so exploring the relevance of the Septuagint for the study of the Bible. Yeah, so many have probably never heard of the Septuagint or know very little about its relevance, right, for the task of interpreting the Bible. So my primary objective tonight is to introduce you to this important corpus of ancient translations. Four areas where the Septuagint contributes significantly to our understanding of the Christian Bible. So this is basically the roadmap that I have planned for us this evening. First, we'll need to discuss specifically what is the Septuagint, and then this will be followed by the four aspects or four areas that I just discussed. That is, the Septuagint helps us identify more accurately the text that should be the basis of our translations of the Old Testament. Secondly, it sheds light on the process of Bible translation and all the challenges that are associated with that. Third, as one of the earliest interpretations of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint opens up interpretative possibilities that can prove helpful even today. And fourth, the Septuagint enables us to better understand the linguistic and conceptual world of the New Testament authors and how they understood and employed the Old Testament scriptures in their writings. So I could have included other points, other aspects in this discussion, such as issues of the biblical canon that we're not really going to get into very much this evening, because as you can imagine, it would take us much beyond the allotted time. So first and foremost, before tackling these four areas, we need to address some key issues in relation to the Septuagint to clarify exactly what we are talking about. And one of the primary issues when dealing with the Septuagint is that exactly, what is the Septuagint, right? So the term Septuagint refers to a collection of translations of individual books of the Old Testament into Greek. And this translation of the various books that make up our Old Testament spans several centuries. And on top of that, there are other books and additions to existing books that were also added along the way, many of which were composed directly into Greek. So these books are sometimes called apocryphal or deuterocanonical. So if you would buy a Septuagint today, it will include all of these Greek documents under one cover, as this very common edition that you see here on the screen, the Ralph's edition of the Septuagint. But it's really worthwhile to reflect on two points in more detail because they're very important for how we interpret this corpus. And the first is that the Septuagint is not a translation in the same sense as modern translations are, translations such as the NIV or the NRSV. That's because our modern translations are the outcome of a concerted effort, usually a translation committee with oversight. And it's a work that's done in a relatively short time frame, and it follows a set of guidelines and policies. But the situation is very different with the Septuagint. It's in large part a collection of translations produced mainly in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. But some books were probably translated as late as the 1st century of our era. So these translations were produced by different individuals or groups at different times, and possibly even in different places. So the second point is that the decision to group these texts together under one cover in modern editions reflect a peculiar situation in the ancient Christian codices of the 4th and 5th centuries. So I'm talking here mainly of Codex Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, which you have here on the screen. So these codices all contain the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible books, that is the 39 Old Testament books of the Protestant canon. But they also include a few other books which vary according to the codex. So for example, Codex A, Alexandrinus, will contain 1 through 4 Maccabees, but Codex Vaticanus will omit them entirely. So you have here on the screen a comparison of the books that you will find in the Protestant Bible and in what we might call the Septuagint, right? In quotes here, and the The books highlighted in red are those that are not in the Protestant Bible. And sometimes these are additions, as you see there at the end of Daniel. So what Ralph's decided to do when he put together his nice blue covered edition that we saw earlier is that he would group all of these books under one volume. He wanted to include all the books found in at least one of these codices. But that's his decision, right? Other editions vary. The older Sweet edition that was done in Cambridge, I believe, included these books and added also the Book of Enoch, which is not found in these Christian codices. So all that to say that there is little evidence that such a conception of the Septuagint existed in New Testament times. For example, when the scriptures were copied in the form of scrolls or papyrus, right? There might be collections of these, but it's only much later in the 4th and 5th century that we find these books together, and these were collated into modern editions, which give us the impression, right, that we have a corpus called the Septuagint. So these two things, the modern printed editions and the use of the term the Septuagint, will contribute to what we might call an illusion, right, of a single translation. That said, we don't want to throw away that word. It's still useful, and we use it consistently, frequently as a shorthand to designate, right, this rather eclectic collection of mostly Jewish books translated into or composed directly in Greek. So let's talk a little bit about the origins of the Septuagint. And in fact, it relates to the name itself. The name Septuagint is quite ancient. It derives from the letter of Aristeas, a Jewish text, possibly dating to the middle of the 2nd century BCE. And this document recounts how King Ptolemy was eager to have the law of the Jews translated for his library in Alexandria. According to the narrative, he sent a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem asking him to send 72 translators to Alexandria, so 6 from each tribe, along with a copy of the Torah. And a large part of this letter serves to praise the wisdom of the Jews and their law in a Hellenistic context. Finally, the letter ends with the story of the translation produced by these 72 men in 72 days. And the translation is said to be perfect, and the Jewish elders pronounce a curse on those who would add or subtract from it. Now, the letter is considered to be largely fictional, and the legend, if you will, of the translators has been embellished over time. If you look in Philo and the Church Fathers, it just keeps getting better and better each time it's retold. But nevertheless, the 72 became the 70 or the LXX, from which the term Septuagint was coined. There is actually an element of the letter that is probably correct, and that's the fact that the initial translation effort focused on the law, the Pentateuch, right, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and that this translation effort was carried out in Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, likely during the reign of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. So many Jews were living in Egypt at the time, soldiers, tradespeople, civil servants, and so on. And they were present pretty much everywhere, including Alexandria, the new capital that was founded by Alexander in the year 332. In fact, it's said that within a century of its foundation, Alexandria was already one of the largest cities of its time, second only to Rome in importance in the ancient world. And the city was divided into 5 districts, one of which was the Jewish quarter. Now, this is much later, but it's estimated that in Roman times, Jews made up 35% of the city's total population, which was estimated at over 500,000 people. So that's a sizable Jewish population, maybe 2 centuries after the period of what we're talking about here for the initial translation. So Greek rapidly gained prominence even outside Alexandria, replacing Aramaic as the lingua franca. And this is probably one of the main reasons for the translation of the Old Testament. There was widespread writing. We found correspondence, contracts, inscriptions. And it's not hard to imagine that translators could be found in this context because there was a lot of translation going on between the native Egyptian language, Greek, Aramaic, and so forth. In fact, the oldest manuscript of the Septuagint have been found in Egypt. And the one that you see here, Ryland 458, is the earliest and dates from the 2nd century BCE. And it was also found, in Egypt. So this is our little intro to what is the Septuagint. Now let's get into the 4 aspects that we discussed earlier in the introduction. So first, the Septuagint, an indispensable tool for the study of the Hebrew Bible. Our modern translations are primarily based on the earliest full text of the Old Testament, which is a codex from the 10th century, Codex Leningradensis, or the Leningrad Codex, which is a representative of the Masoretic text. This is, on the whole, a very reliable witness to the text of the Old Testament. But the copying of manuscripts, as you can imagine, even when it's done very carefully, will inevitably lead to changes, or what we might call scribal mistakes and whatnot, right? And there might even be changes that are deliberate, as we will see later. So part of the work of scholars is to compare manuscripts and make sure that we base our work on the earliest recoverable text. In many cases, the textual history of a book can be compared to a tree, and I think this is a nice way to conceptualize things, with different manuscripts placed on different branches of this textual tree. For example, here you have a stemma or tree of Deuteronomy made by Benjamin Seymour, where he attempts to place the various manuscripts that have been found in relation to each other. And in some cases, it's very difficult because many of these manuscripts are very fragmentary. So that's perhaps why there's question mark next to a lot of them. But in any case, it's very useful because you have the archetype at the top, right? And then the various branches as they seem to be relating to each other. So as you can see, the Masoretic text that we're just discussing is on the left and descends from the archetype in a rather direct fashion. The other 2 main witnesses, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, are further along a different branch. They share this branch right in the early stages, and then they diverge into their own separate branch. Now, you might ask, how can we put a Greek translation on a tree of Hebrew manuscripts, right? Well, that's because the Greek translation is rather literal, as we might say. So it's not very difficult to discern what would be the underlying Hebrew source text, especially when we compare it with the other Hebrew manuscripts. So that's how we can pretty much figure out where it belongs in the textual tree. Now, the Septuagint being on a different branch means that there are a number of differences with the Masoretic text, but these are often relatively minor, like harmonizations. Now, we're talking about Deuteronomy here. It might be different. It will be different for other books, but this is the one that I'm most familiar with. And so for Deuteronomy, those of you that are familiar with the book will know that it repeats many expressions, such as, the land that I swore to give to your fathers, or doing what is right and good in the sight of the Lord. Now, these reoccur frequently throughout the book. And in our Masoretic text, or MT, as we abbreviate it, they will often appear a little different from one instance to the next. But when we look at these in the Septuagint, they are often harmonized. They all look the same. And there's a good reason to think that that was already the case in the translation's Hebrew source text. Another example that we'll discuss later, now if we look at a concrete example, is in Deuteronomy 6:13, where we find the command to serve the Lord exclusively. As you'll see, if we compare the Masoretic text version to the Septuagint version is slightly longer, the text that you see in bold here. It adds, and to him you shall cling. And we might ask, okay, why do we have this addition here? But it turns out that it's not haphazard if we consider that the command, a similar command, is found later in the book in 1020. It includes this clinging command in the middle, right there. So this is considered an assimilation, as is often found in other witnesses, such as the Samaritan Pentateuch. So whoever was responsible for the Septuagint of 613 or its underlying Hebrew text either deliberately harmonized both, right, to make them look the same, or perhaps when he was copying it, had the text memorized, right, and from memory wrote down the longer version. It's hard to know exactly what occurred in these cases. Now, there are situations that are a little different from this. In this case, right, the Septuagint version is clearly secondary. It seems to be harmonizing, but that's not always the case. In 1 Samuel 2:33, another rather straightforward example, there's a prophecy on the house of Eli the priest. And here MT seems to be missing something, right? When it says, all the increase in your house shall die, men are, yeah, so the Tanakh translations here, translation adds as ordinary men, perhaps, trying to make sense of the difficult Hebrew text. And in fact, this passage has occasioned all kinds of difficulties for translators who focus solely on the Masoretic text here. But on the other hand, if we look at the Septuagint text, we see that it adds, there's a longer version, and it adds the phrase by the sword in this location, which leads to the full phrase, they will die by the swords of men, or the sword of men. Now, that makes a little more sense. And what's interesting is that this reading is also supported by an ancient Hebrew manuscript among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and is normally accepted as the original. In this case, our modern translations often adopt the Septuagint reading or make a note of it for their readers. So this is nothing surprising for many of our modern translations. They will often look at these things and try to incorporate what seems to be an obvious better reading in such cases. Now, there are more difficult cases, and one of these is found in Deuteronomy 32:8. In this verse, we find a description of God or the Most High setting the boundaries of various nations according to the number of, and this is where the variant differences appear, right? In the Hebrew Masoretic text, we find that the criteria is the sons of Israel. That's what's used to fix the boundaries. But in the Septuagint, we rather have the sons of God, or the divine sons, as is rendered here in the New English translation of the Septuagint. But here also, as in 1 Samuel, the Septuagint reading is also attested by a Dead Sea Scroll manuscript. So this means that it's likely not the work of the translator, but that this version already existed in his Hebrew source text. And here also, the consensus is that the Septuagint reading is likely the original. And this is another situation where the Septuagint helps us get beyond our most important Hebrew manuscripts, the MT, to an earlier form of the text. In this case, we could say maybe a little more on this. The modification seems deliberate. This is not what might be called a scribal error, as perhaps the 1 Samuel example was. The modification towards sons of Israel might have been made to avoid the impression, giving the impression of, some kind of polytheism in the Pentateuch. That's despite the fact that the divine council idea is still present elsewhere in the Old Testament. The Pentateuch is seen as the canon within the canon for Jews in this period. And this modification will also have been part of a broader series of small changes that affect this verse, and also Exodus 1:5 and Genesis 46:27. So in these two texts I just named, there's a mention of the number of Israel's or Jacob's sons, his family really, that go down to Egypt. And what's interesting is that the Septuagint has 75 people, or counts 75 people, but the Hebrew Masoretic text has 70. the individuals are counted differently, but why? It seems that this has to do with the table of nations in Genesis 11, which contains 70 nations. So when you put all of this together, right, it seems that ancient scribes linked these texts and made the number of Israel's sons match the number of nations, right? Because their boundaries were fixed in accordance to that number. So it all becomes one equation, if you will. Now, our translations usually note these differences, but they don't all follow the Septuagint in these passages. These are just a few examples, all relatively minor. But I hope to have shown that the Septuagint's role is important, right, when it comes to establishing the text of our Old Testament books. What is going to be the basis of our translations? Well, we need the Septuagint. And it's good to know that many of these differences, and the most significant ones, have been known for a long time and have already been incorporated into our modern translations, either in the main text, as I was saying, or in a note. Nevertheless, the work of establishing the text, what we call textual criticism, is an ongoing project. Okay, let's move on to our second aspect, which deals with the task of Bible translation. So this is another area where the Septuagint is useful in helping us conceptualize the task of biblical translation. And in fact, the Septuagint is, when we think of it, near the beginning of a long tradition of biblical translation. It's perhaps even the most ancient and significant ancestor, the granddaddy of our modern translations. It's interesting in this context to consult the prologue of the book of Ben Sirach, or Sirach, which dates to the second half of the 2nd century BCE. It contains one of the earliest references to the Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures, and it highlights a number of relevant points. So let me read it for you. So you are invited, therefore, to read it. This is his translation of his grandfather's work. You're invited, therefore, to read it with goodwill and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where, despite our diligent labor in translating, we may seem to have rendered some phrases imperfectly. For what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. Not only this book, but even the law itself, the prophecies, and the rest of the books differ not a little when read in the original. So this is the reference, this last phrase, to existing translations from Hebrew to Greek, which would probably be the Septuagint of the Pentateuch and prophets, and the rest is a little more difficult to ascertain. I continue. When I came to Egypt in the 38th year of the reign of Ur-Getes and stayed for some time, I found opportunity for no little instruction. It seemed highly necessary that I should myself devote some diligence and labor to the translation of this book, for those living abroad who wish to gain learning and are disposed to live according to the law. So there's a few interesting points that I want to highlight in this text that relate to the task of translation. And the first, in the very first sentence that I've read here, talks about, highlights the difficulties related to the task of translating. I'm sure some of you have already experienced this. The task of translation is a very daunting one, and there's many reasons for this. One of them is that the distance between languages can introduce a considerable level of complexity and makes it more difficult to find easy equivalence between one element of the source language and another of the target language. And this is the case with the Septuagint, since its translators were working from a Semitic language and rendering it into an Indo-European one. What's useful, though, is that Greek is relatively flexible when it comes to word order, even if this can introduce some strange turns of phrase for readers or listeners of the time. You might think of it as the way the character Yoda speaks in Star Wars, right? Always in motion is the future, or named must your fear be, before banish it you can. Sometimes I'm sure the Septuagint must have sounded a little bit like this to its first listeners, and it's hard work to do this translation work. Another thing that I want to highlight in this short text is that there are inevitable differences between a translation and its original, and this is seen in the second half of the first paragraph. And we'll discuss this more in detail in the next point. And the third point I wanted to highlight is near the end, in the last sentence, right? Why is translation done? And or the grandson here says, right, it's for those living abroad who wish to gain learning and are disposed to live according to the law. So often, right, it's the broader diffusion of a work that motivates translation. It's thought that in Egypt in the 3rd century, that Hebrew was not as prevalent as it used to be, or not known, not spoken and understood by Jews, by a majority of Jews, and might be one of the reasons why the Septuagint translations were initiated, despite the letter of Aristeas stating that it was perhaps for prestige, right, for the king's library. There are many theories that have been put forth on this, and we don't have a whole lot of data, but certainly that the linguistic factor and the diffusion of the Hebrew scriptures was part of the motivations. So recent studies of the Septuagint have tried to avoid prescriptive assessments of what is a good translation, and instead try to favor a descriptive approach, using, among other things, descriptive translation studies. A generation or two ago, just to give you some context, Septuagint translators were often criticized either for their clumsy style when people compared their Greek to classical Greek, or they were criticized for their lack of precision as translators, because some thought that, precision requires always using the same Hebrew Greek equivalents, especially when you're working in a legal text, right? But this is very prescriptive. We think we know what they should have been doing, right, in terms of their style and in terms of their approach. But in a descriptive approach, we rather try to understand how the process came about without passing judgment. Rather, we try to figure out, or to discern what might have been the objectives of the translation, its function, and so on. And this is the reason why we can ask some questions, such as the two you see here on the screen. To what extent does the translator seek to reproduce the style and constructions of the source language, or to favor the conventions of the target language? The second question is related to the first and provides some answers. What is this translation's intended function? What is its place in relation to other translations? And what concrete needs is it intended to meet? And the answers to these questions will provide an orientation or an idea as to the translation approach and the style that's favored. Now, the difficulty with the Septuagint is that we don't have we can't interview the translators and ask them what their intentions were and why they adopted this approach and not that other approach, and so forth. And so we're constrained to look at basically what we have before us, right? The source text by and large, and the target text, and try to figure out, okay, how they did things and what might be the motivations behind this. So if we look at a text like Deuteronomy 1:1, you don't need to know Greek and Hebrew to notice that by and large, the translation approach favored by this translator and most Septuagint translators really favors the reproduction of Hebrew constructions. It's almost a word-for-word, what we would call a word-for-word approach. There are only a few omissions at the bottom of the middle column there. This is not systematic, and there are more idiomatic Greek phrases to be found. And in fact, despite the word-for-word approach in this verse particularly, the Greek is by and large conventional Greek. But if you look at the book as a whole, this general approach ends up producing a work that definitely has a Hebrew flavor. And this is very much in keeping with many translations today. Many people prefer a so-called literal translation because it's often associated with a more faithful and biblical style. So another thing to note here is that you can see how various manuscripts, these are later manuscripts, added the phrase kai anameson to correspond to these Hebrew words, to bring it even closer to the Hebrew. And this was an approach that became more popular as time went on and revisions were made of the Septuagint text, even though it produces repetition here of anameson that's unconventional Greek. But even in this format, even in this mode of translation, there's considerable space for creativity. If we go back to 32.8, where we were earlier, we also find this kind of one-to-one equivalence between the Hebrew and Greek text, but there is variation introduced in this framework. In Hebrew, the first two lines are syntactically parallel. It's basically the same syntax, but the translator employs two different constructions in Greek. So on the first line, you'll have a hote and an imperfect, and on the second line, a hos and an aorist. So conversely, you'll find two nouns in Hebrew describing the people, right? The nations and the peoples, as is rendered here in this translation. But the translator levels these two and chooses the word ethne for both, right? And you see in green on the other side. This is actually in keeping with the translator's preferred word for designating peoples other than Israel. So when he's talking about peoples outside of Israel, his preferred word is ethne. But when he's talking about Israel, he will usually employ the word laos, right? So what I'm trying to say is that there's a motivation for this semantic leveling that we are observing here. So all this to say that it reminds us that there's a number of factors and imperatives that go into Bible translation. We might ask, okay, which is best? And this is a question I often get. And the answer is, well, it depends, right? Which translation is best? It depends. The intended function of the Septuagint of Deuteronomy was probably different than that of later revisions, like Aquila, which really mirrored the source text almost mechanically. So perhaps Septuagint Deuteronomy was more of a facilitating text that still retained the prestige associated with its Hebrew source. So the result is that we'll not want to judge a translation on its style or its approach, rather on whether it fulfills its intended function. And the same is true for modern translations, right? There are a variety of options for us, and it all depends on what function it's intended to fulfill. So again, here, I think the Septuagint can help us better appreciate our modern translations and all of their variety and the work that goes into producing them. It's truly a daunting task. All right, let's look at the fourth point here, which relates to translation and interpretation. You may have heard the saying that all translation is interpretation, right? This is something that we hear oftentimes. And a statement that would be a little extreme to accept at face value. But we do have to admit that before producing a translation, we need to properly understand the source text, right? When you're translating, you need to know what you're translating, first of all. So in this sense, interpretation precedes translation. In many, and perhaps most cases, the meaning of the text that is translated presents no major difficulties, and it's not difficult to produce an equivalent meaning in the target language. But that said, interpretation remains a challenge. And maybe for simplicity's sake, we could conceive of two types of interpretation. The first I would label unavoidable interpretation, and the second, deliberate interpretation. So let's look a little bit at those two. Yeah. Unavoidable interpretation is where the translator is obliged, it has to resolve an ambiguity that is present in the text or one that stems from the mismatch between the languages. In other words, sometimes it's the text itself that's unclear. What does it mean exactly? Other times, a word in the text can take on, or an expression can take on several meanings in the source language, and those have no direct equivalent in the target language, and therefore the translator must choose in between various options. An example of this, and a thorny problem for translators, is the rendering of the Hebrew name Eved. It can designate a number of things, from a slave to a servant to a minister. Think of a civil servant today. How to render it into English is problematic because its most frequent match, slave, historically speaking, is often associated with chattel slavery in our culture. It's a situation that's quite different in many respects from the Eved in many Old Testament contexts. So to take but one example, modern translators working on Exodus 21:2 have to make a decision here, which English equivalent is appropriate for the word Eved that appears here. When you buy a Hebrew male Eved, what's the right term, right? So in the NRSV, you have the choice of slave, whereas in the NIV, they opt for a servant. Now, in our context, a servant has more autonomy than a slave, and perhaps also a little more than this individual in the Exodus law, right? Who's basically serving his master for 6 years, right? So anyway, the purpose of this example is not to argue in favor of either option. I simply want to point out, to illustrate that a translator has to choose one or the other options, or maybe make up a third that will maybe alleviate the problem, because there's no term in English that perfectly matches the Hebrew. But what's important here is that the translator cannot avoid the problem. He has to make a choice, and this is what I mean by an unavoidable interpretation. And by the way, this is why Moses Silva says that learning original languages doesn't always clarify the meaning of the text. In fact, the knowledge of the biblical languages often makes us aware of more possibilities or ambiguities than the translators had to resolve for us, that we don't notice when we read the text in translation. Now, if we get back to the Septuagint, it provides, as a translation, it provides us with many such interpretations, and these actually raise useful questions for us. There's an example of this found in Deuteronomy 25, 2 and 3, are the junction, really, of these two texts. So this is a passage that deals with a measured punishment, right? Someone is found guilty, and he will be beaten in the judge's presence, with a number of lashes proportionate to the offense. That's the translation of the Hebrew in the NRSV. 40 lashes may be given, but not more. So we know that the Hebrew syntax here allows for a more permissive interpretation, right? They may strike him. It's not an obligation. But it could also be interpreted as a more directive one. They shall strike him. That's also a possibility in the syntax with the Yichtal form here. And so what does a translator do? He's faced with a choice. He has to decide how he's going to render this verb, and our Septuagint translator opts for the Greek future tense, which in this context indicates a command. So as you see on the text on the right, they shall beat him with the number 40. So what was a permission, perhaps in the Hebrew, becomes a more forceful obligation. There's another element of ambiguity, and that's found at the end of verse 2 and the beginning of verse 3. Does the expression in number or proportionate, right, with the number or in number, does it belong to verse 2, as is indicated by the Masoretic signs here, or does it belong to verse 3, as is shown in the majority of Greek manuscripts? Now, the first option favors a number of blows that can vary according to the crime. You will strike him according to his guilt in number, right? The second option seems to apply a fixed 40 blows, right? By the number 40, you will strike him. And what's interesting is that the second interpretation is the one that becomes predominant in ancient Judaism. This is exactly how the prescription is explained later in the Mishnah 40-1, right? By dividing the verses differently than what we find in the Masoretic text. or said otherwise, dividing the verses just like we see here in the Greek text. This is also what we find in Josephus, who, for this passage, and he even takes the 40 blows and applies it to other laws in Deuteronomy without explicit warrant from the text. And of course, many of you will be familiar with Paul's own description of his punishment, the punishment that he suffered. And he said this 5 times he received from the Jews the 40 strokes minus 1. So in this case, it's difficult to say whether the translator read it, how he divided the verses, since he's not responsible for the verse divisions that we observe in later manuscripts. But it's certainly conceivable that he was operating in a context where interpretations of these texts were circulating and probably influencing his translation in places. On other occasions, there are no precise issues of meaning or equivalence between languages, but it seems the translator wants to avoid an interpretation of the text that he considers erroneous, and it will therefore direct the reader towards the interpretation of his choice. And maybe there's often not an absolute boundary between obligatory and deliberate interpretation. One can give rise to the other. Difficulty can give rise to a more creative interpretation. But here's a case that we find quite often that's well known, the Septuagint. The Hebrew word mizbeach is used to describe a variety of altars in the Pentateuch and elsewhere. But the translators of the Pentateuch want to make sure that the distinction between 2 types of altars, legitimate and illegitimate altars, is clear to their readers. So when the context indicates that it's an altar to a foreign god, the translator will use the term bomos, as you see there in Deuteronomy 7:5. But when it comes to an altar to the Lord, he uses a neologism, thusiasterion, and this neologism, if we can call it that, first occurs in Exodus. It's derived from the noun thusia, sacrifice, right? So this is a creative way of making sure that readers understand that, okay, we're talking about different types of altars here, and you need to be sure which altar you deal with appropriately. So perhaps because of all this, the Septuagint provides us with avenues of interpretation, maybe not always the best ones, but at least it shows us that other people before us have tried to solve many of the same difficulties that we face today when we try to interpret the Bible. So in this sense, we can maybe think of the Septuagint as the first biblical commentary. Now, commentary might be maybe a bit of a strong word, but in a sense, it already interprets the text for us. Now let's look at our last point, New Testament authors and their world. So there's a few areas that I want to highlight here where the Septuagint influences New Testament authors. The first is style. New Testament authors seem to be familiar with the Greek style of the Septuagint and often reproduce the same turns of phrase that might otherwise seem strange. You know, the Yoda style I was talking about earlier. An example of this is the narrative style of Luke's gospel, which often employs what some people call Septuagintalisms. So they're Greek constructions, I have them in red here, that are really frequent in the narrative portions of the Greek Old Testament. And so these are not found normally in Greek outside of the Bible, but Luke especially likes to include these, the kai ageneto, kai idu, and kai ageneto kai. The kai here would absolutely not be necessary in Greek. In fact, it probably sounds a little strange in this position. It happened in one of those days, and he was teaching. So yeah, it sounds a little bit strange to our ears. But why is Luke doing this, right? Maybe your question. And it's probably a case here where the repeated use of these Septuagintalisms, as we might call them, serve the purpose of giving the narrative a certain scriptural or biblical style, right? It's in the fashion of Old Testament narratives. It's the continuation of these narratives. Another way that the Septuagint influences or helps our reading of the New Testament is that there are a number of words that have specialized meanings in the Septuagint that are also used in the New Testament in a similar way. You can think of evangelizomai, to proclaim the good news of salvation. We find in Isaiah 40, for example, which is also employed in the New Testament. And the good news becomes, right, the good news of Jesus or the coming kingdom, right? This is a more specialized usage that's taken up from the Septuagint and applied more specifically to Jesus. And the same could be said of other words like doxa, ecclesia, especially in Paul. Now, ecclesia, you might sometimes hear some definitions of these words that are based on etymology, right? Ecclesia. That's probably not the best way to look at this word. In fact, if you look at its usage in the Septuagint, this is a term employed to designate the community of Israel, the assembly of Israel. It's a very common term in the Greek of this period to designate an assembly, even a public assembly, but it's more than that, right? It's the assembly of the people of God. That's what it becomes in the Septuagint, and it's taken up in the New Testament to designate this new people of God, right? The church, as we might call it. And then, of course, you have key concepts like kurios, which is a translation of the tetragrammaton in the Septuagint, so the divine name, which is applied to Jesus in the New Testament. Hoon, that he who is, right, a translation of the divine name in Exodus 3, which is taken up in various places in the New Testament, in Revelation, for example, to speak of God as the one being, right, the one who is, who was, and will be. So these are all three reasons why the Septuagint is really indispensable as a background to the New Testament. And another significant aspect of this relationship between these two corpuses is the use of the Old Testament scriptures in the New. And I want to quickly go through one rather simple example here to illustrate this point. And it's the relationship between the Deuteronomy 6:13 passage we saw earlier and the temptation narrative in Matthew 4 and Luke 4. So if you look at these texts side by side, you see that Jesus or Satan says to Jesus, "All these I will give you if you fall down and worship me." And Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." So you see here that there are a couple of differences, right? The verb is not the same. The Deuteronomy passage has fear the Lord, whereas the quotation has the verb worship. And then the Matthew and Luke passage add the adverb only, or serve only him. Now, it seems clear, right, that the author of these two Gospels is quoting from the Old Testament. That the text is introduced by the phrase, right, "It is written," gegraptai. So does it go back to a different text than those that we have, either in Hebrew or Greek, or is there some other explanation? Right. So there are several factors to consider in such a comparison, but it seems here that the Greek text of Deuteronomy did contain fear, and that there's no reason to see worship there before its use in the New Testament. There will be some later manuscript that will harmonize these two passages, but it's unlikely that the gospel author had a different text than the one we have. So what other possibilities could we consider? Could Matthew have adapted the Old Testament text for some reason? Well, in this case, the answer seems to be yes. The verb to worship is in fact found in the proposal that Satan makes to Jesus, right? "I will give you all this if you will bow down and worship me," right? So the repetition of Deuteronomy 6:13, of worship in Deuteronomy 6:13 seems to be related more directly to this invitation to fear God and to serve him is to worship him. And of course, worshiping anyone other than God is problematic, and perhaps this also serves as bringing that issue into focus. And the addition of alone perhaps also underlines this point. The worship of God must be exclusive, and this is not at odds with the wider context of the quotation in Deuteronomy 6. You have the Decalogue, that's just a chapter prior. So the addition of only here might have been thought necessary to make the implied meaning more explicit. I think it's helpful in this context to make a distinction between what we consider today as a quotation or best practices when quoting a text, with the requirements of precision, down to mistakes that might be present in a quoted text that we have to reproduce, right? This is how we deal with quotations today, and the way that authors quoted others in antiquity. The fact that the New Testament authors state, as is written, or so-and-so said, does not seem to constrain them to a word-for-word quotation. In fact, we often find that there is freedom to adapt the Old Testament text to the New Testament context, as seems to be the case here. So this particular example is part of the gospel writer's wider strategy of showing how Jesus obeys divine law and overcomes temptation, something that Israel was unable to do in the desert. So in retracing the steps of Israel, Jesus, in Matthew narrative especially, Jesus shows that he is the obedient son. So the Septuagint helps us to understand, by comparing these texts, to understand the connections that the gospel author wanted to make and the aspects that he wanted to highlight especially. Now, if you were curious and want to find out more about this, I've done a few videos with Larry Perkins, who's really an expert in these matters. And this is actually an example that we discussed in one of these videos. You can find them on the Weavers Institute YouTube channel. So to conclude then, I hope I've given you a glimpse of how the Septuagint can help us better understand the Bible. It helps us better ascertain our Old Testament text. As the forerunner of our modern translations, it helps us understand and appreciate the task of biblical translation. As the first commentary or interpretation of the Old Testament, it occupied an important place in the development of Jewish traditions and Christian teaching. So I think that familiarizing oneself with its contents and even the so-called apocryphal books can be of great benefit for understanding the Bible. So I would advise you then, to conclude, to go and buy a Septuagint. There are many options now in several modern languages, and even in English, you have at least 3 translations easily available, and even freely on the web, such as the New English translation of the Septuagint here, which was made in part by fellows of the Weavers Institute that some of you know very well. So thank you so much for your attention.